CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie O.
And I'm Andrew Wilson. Our top stories. Ukraine's President Zelensky arrives in Washington to meet President Biden. The U.S. confirms it will supply Kiev with the Patriot missile system to boost air defences.
Our other headlines, President Putin tells his generals Russia isn't to blame for his invasion of Ukraine, saying the two countries share a tragedy.
Don't get ill. The warning as UK ambulance crews go on strike in a dispute over pay and conditions.
And the men and women who've spent their lives trying to build relations between Britain and China.
The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is on his way to the United States for talks with President Joe Biden. It's his first trip out of Ukraine since the 10-month invasion began.
Polish television has released these pictures of Zelensky and his advisers arriving in northern Poland ahead of his flight to Washington. Zelensky also expected to address Congress. This will coincide with a vote on a further $45 billion in U.S. military aid to Ukraine. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett in New York. John, what can we expect in all to hear on this trip?
Well, it's not going to be a very long trip, I can tell you that. Zelensky is in the air at the moment, heading to Washington, D.C. And for us in North America, in Washington and here in New York, it's all going to take place in the late afternoon and the early evening. He's going to go straight to the Oval, where he's going to meet with President Biden, and they'll have sit-down, face-to-face talks. It's described as strategic talks about the future of the operation in Ukraine. There will then be a joint press conference immediately after that at the White House, and at that press conference, President Biden is expected to announce the deployment by the United States to Ukraine of a Patriot missile battery. Now, this is the thing that President Zelensky has wanted for the longest time. It is the state-of-the-art anti-missile system that the United States has. And the U.S. is going to announce that it will be deployed in Ukraine, but training for it by U.S. forces of the Ukrainian military forces will take place in a third country. And then President Zelensky will go to Capitol Hill, where he will make a joint address to Congress. Now, you may remember that he did this earlier this year. However, that one was virtual, and this one is going to be face-to-face. And, of course, the Russians are not very happy about this. Within the last 12 hours or so, they've announced unrestricted finance for the Russian army, and it's been announced that the former Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev has been in Beijing talking to President Xi of China. All of this, of course, a way of pushing back against and trying to take the headlines away from President Zelensky.
John, how significant is it that President Zelensky feels confident enough to leave Ukraine in the middle of a war, and that his first trip outside Ukraine is to Washington?
Yes, I know. I mean, I think that is the whole significant thing, really. The fact that he feels confident to leave the country at all is probably the major headline. We've learnt that they came up with this idea about 10 days ago between President Zelensky and President Biden. So it's been a pretty quick turnaround from the initial suggestion to the point of it actually happening. And I think that President Zelensky has had the upper hand throughout all of this because of the security situations. And my understanding is that it was nearly called off on a number of occasions because of security risks. But it is going ahead. He is in the air. And the other significant thing, I think, is that he's coming here 300 days after the beginning of the special military operation in Ukraine. And as you say, it is the first time he's been outside the country since it began back in February. And his message is going to be both to the domestic audience back home in Kiev and indeed here in the United States, but also a much wider global audience. And his key message is going to be, look, despite everything, despite constant bombardment from Russian forces in areas that have been left alone for quite a while, which have knocked out key installations, including power, Ukraine is okay. It's, pushing back against the Russian special military operation, and its people, although suffering incredible privations, are actually surviving and getting through this. And that's going to be the main point of his message. Of course, seeking more support and more money will be part of it as well.
Can we talk about the more money? Because there have been these reports of some Republicans worried about the cost of military aid to Ukraine. How do you sense support is holding up in the United States?
It's wavering, no question about that. The background to this is that the Congress is in the process at the moment of making the final changes to what will be an omnibus bill that will provide yet more funding for Ukraine. Now, you'll hear throughout the day various numbers bandied around, but it will in total be about $45 billion when all is said and done. And the money will be used for the military and also for economic issues in Ukraine. And, of course, this comes on top of the billions and billions of dollars that the United States has sent to Ukraine since the beginning of that special military operation there. Now, the Republicans are said to be pretty uneasy about the level of spending that has come out of the Biden administration. A Wall Street Journal survey recently suggested that something like 30% of all Americans are uneasy too. Most of them, though, are Republicans, apparently. And Kevin McCarthy, who is, if you like, the leader of the Republicans in the House of Representatives, he is on course to be the Speaker to replace Nancy Pelosi in January. Now, it's not guaranteed that he will actually get that job. There are issues behind the scenes within the Republican Party, but he at the moment is the likely successor. And he has said there will be no blank check for Ukraine. So it looks as if the Republican Party is gearing up to basically disrupt President Biden's plans at every level using the vehicle that they have, the House of Representatives, where they actually have a slim majority after November's midterm elections, and that looks like it's going to include funding for Ukraine as well. So we'll have to wait and see.
John, thanks for that. Our correspondent John Terrett in New York.
President Putin has said that Russia isn't to blame for his invasion of Ukraine, saying that the countries share a tragedy.
The Kremlin hit out at President Zelensky's trip to the United States, saying it risked deepening the conflict. Speaking after a meeting with his generals, Putin announced plans to increase Russia's military effort in Ukraine. He said a new generation of Russian ballistic missiles would be deployed to boost efforts on the front line, which would have no equivalent in the world.
This year, the share of new weapons in strategic nuclear forces was over 91%. We're supplying our military with new avant-garde hypersonic missiles, and in the future, new Sarmat intercontinental missiles will be readied. It's a bit later than we expected, but it doesn't change our overall plans.
Chinese President Xi Jinping has been meeting chairman of the United Russia Party, Dmitry Medvedev. They talked about the two countries' strategic partnership and the Ukraine crisis. Xi said China's position on the crisis remains consistent and hoped the parties would maintain restraint. Both sides also exchanged ideas on how to further promote cooperation in trade, energy and agriculture.
China and Australia are making efforts to improve diplomatic ties as they mark the 50th anniversary of their relationship. Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong is in China for a two-day visit. She met her Chinese counterpart Wang Yi and talked trade, security and human rights. Both sides agreed to continue dialogue in a range of areas, including climate change.
President Xi Jinping says China is ready to advance relations with Australia. China remains Australia's largest trading partner in goods. Bilateral trade shot up 35% to over $230 billion last year. Well, our correspondent Greg Navarro now looks at how a change of government in Australia could be changing the course of its relationship with China.
Australia's first steps toward establishing formal diplomatic relations with China began with former Prime Minister Gough Whitlam in 1972. Since then, there have been many highlights, including the signing of the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement in 2015. 2 years later, both countries look to take their relationship even further. A lavish ceremony marked the China-Australia Year of Tourism.
It's a year to celebrate bonds that cannot be broken.
But those bonds have strained since then, hitting a low point in 2020 when Australia called for an international investigation into the origins of COVID-19, and China responded with trade blockages and tariffs on several Australian exports. In May, Australia changed leaders and signaled a change in its approach to dealing with the country's largest trading partner.
The new government has actually been quite open and transparent that it has sought to change the tone with which it has managed the China relationship.
Professor James Lawrenson is the director of the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney. He says Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong has played a major role in Australia's renewed approach to China.
She's referring, for example, to China as a comprehensive strategic partner. Now, that's a bit of diplomatic speak, but that actually answers one of the key complaints Beijing has had for the last year, whether Australia sees China as a partner, a threat, or even an enemy. Well, Penny Wong's calling China a strategic partner.
On the Chinese side, I think what shouldn't be underestimated are the efforts that the new Chinese ambassador to Australia is making to bring relations back on a more even keel.
We're ready to work together with Australia's new government to put this relationship back on the right track.
Last month, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese met with Chinese President Xi Jinping, the first leaders meeting between the two countries since 2016. But experts say the world is a much different place today than it was 50 years ago.
We are in a period of geostrategic competition where what happens between Australia and China and the way we develop our relations doesn't depend on us alone, but it depends on the geostrategic context. So that makes things different and sometimes more complicated.
Greg Navarro, CGTN, Sydney.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Germany's biggest ever accounting fraud. Defendants turn on each other at the Wirecard trial. We're in Berlin. Next.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
This week on Razor, it's our end-of-year special, where we look back at some of the memorable stories we've had the privilege to cover.
Obviously, every story I work on with Razor I enjoy and love deeply, but this was one that really stuck with me.
Okay, so we're in the large intestine now. Yeah, it's actually kind of the capital of your microbiome. About 99% of everything you have in and on you is in your intestines.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Quick reminder, CGTN's available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK on Freeview.
More than 10,000 ambulance staff in the UK are on strike over pay and conditions.
Ambulances are answering emergency calls only. It follows a two-day walkout by nurses across England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Ministers have urged the public to take extra care and avoid contact sports and unnecessary car journeys. It's the latest in a series of strikes by UK public sector workers. Well, our correspondent Julia Chapman is outside Waterloo Ambulance Station in London. Julia, good to see you. What's the mood amongst the workers down there on the picket line?
Overwhelmingly, it is a spirit of defiance and disappointment that it has come to this point. All of the paramedics and ambulance drivers that we've been speaking to today say they do not want to go on strike. They would much rather be at work earning their incomes, but they say this is a necessary move to put pressure on the government in order to engage in negotiations over pay and conditions. The government has said that it has offered a 4% pay rise across the healthcare services in the UK. Unions say that simply isn't enough for many of them to tackle the cost of living crisis, with inflation sitting at 10.7% here in the UK. Now, as you said, ambulances are only responding to the most critical call-outs, but ironically, one ambulance worker we spoke to says they're probably responding to them more quickly today than they usually would. We've been seeing really long wait times for ambulances at emergency departments across the country, but today there is actually more staff on deck because some of the military has been drafted in to help out. And in fact, even the guys striking behind me are nipping off to certain emergencies when really critical calls do come in. That was under a promise arranged between the unions and the healthcare services to protect life and limb despite the strike today.
And Julia, still no sign of any kind of resolution in this?
No, that's certainly far from it. We are not seeing the government willing to engage in pay negotiations. They say that 4% figure that they have offered NHS workers across the country has been recommended by an independent pay review body, looking at all of the factors under consideration, including the government budget, including the cost of living in the UK right now. Unions say that is not, in fact, an independent body, and that recommendation simply doesn't go far enough. So that is why they have decided to come on strike today. We're starting to see more widespread strikes in the healthcare sector. We've also heard some fiery language as well from the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, this morning, who accused unions of making a conscious decision to inflict harm on patients. The unions have flatly rejected that, saying if there are any lamentable deaths today, then they would be the fault of the government.
And Julia, these strike days are becoming daily events now. It's almost as if the UK is being hit by a perfect storm of industrial action with still no sign of any kind of off-ramp or exit plan.
Undoubtedly, we are seeing more and more of these. It is pretty unusual to see healthcare workers go on strike, but yesterday around 100,000 nurses walked out. They did so last week as well. They're likely to do so again in the new year. The ambulance workers behind me are planning more strikes in the new year as well. And it isn't just healthcare workers, those in the public sector. We're also seeing a number of railway workers going on pretty regular strike for many months now. Postal workers as well, calling for better pay. Civil servants have been balloted to strike in the new year. So lots of sectors under pressure right now as the cost of living has been going up in this country, saying that they can't afford to heat their homes, to feed their families with costs rising so rapidly. And they believe that they are owed a higher pay rise than what the government is offering.
Julia, thanks very much indeed. Julia Chapman there in South London for us.
Christmas lighting is being dimmed this year, another impact of those soaring energy prices.
It's not just in the home that budgets are tight. Many local authorities in the UK are now scaling back their usual public displays. Our correspondent Kitty Logan now reports.
London is glowing for the Christmas season. The stars are out, and for many, it's time to indulge. But there's a shift in this year's festive mood amid sharply rising energy bills. This central London light display is on for only a third of the usual hours, a sustainable show of LED bulbs and recycled plastic designed to reduce power usage. This cautious approach to Christmas is reflected around the country. A recent survey by Go Compare found many consumers trying to cut festive energy bills.
And we were surprised that more people than ever are worried about it. So we had about 16%, so 1 in 6 customers saying that they would be putting up no Christmas lights over the Christmas period, and about 25% of customers saying they would put up less lights over the Christmas period.
But for others, Christmas is a time to forget any financial worries and lighten the mood. The good news is the cost of Christmas lighting can be very minimal if used carefully.
Can I cut down my the number of hours that I've got my lights on. Can I go LED instead of traditional bulbs? And if you can, and you think is appropriate, having a flashing light bulb instead.
The cost of living crisis has also prompted questions about funding public Christmas events. The traditional Christmas switch on is guaranteed family fun. Bringing communities together and brightening up town centres in gloomy times. But not everyone wants to join in this year's Christmas party. Some local authorities have scaled back on Christmas lighting and events this year to reduce costs. But for others, a little bit of Christmas sparkle not only lifts the mood, but it also boosts high street trade. Many local businesses help pay for Christmas lights. With most prices up, they hope to entice customers who may otherwise be reluctant to spend.
And they come along here to do their Christmas shopping, and for the small businesses it's absolutely essential at this time of year. So the foot traffic on the high street is equivalent to the number of Christmas lights we can put up.
As people prepare for that special Christmas meal, the cost of cooking is another consumer concern. Many watching heating bills closely too while hosting guests. Energy experts advise caution but say higher costs shouldn't spoil celebrations. Though for some, this Christmas will be without the usual bright lights. Kitty Logan, CGTN, London.
Donald Trump's tax returns could be published within days after a US House committee backed the move. That follows a long legal battle by Democrats to obtain the documents, which cover the years Trump began his run for president in 2015 to the time he left office in 2021. The committee's already criticized the US Internal Revenue Service for failing to audit the accounts while Trump was in the White House.
Space flights will take off from Britain for the first time after Virgin Orbit was given the go-ahead by the regulators. Richard Branson's company is developing its own spaceport in Cornwall in the southwest of England. The UK Transport Minister Mark Harper says it's an historic step towards the UK's galactic gateway. The first launch from Spaceport Cornwall is due to take place in the coming weeks.
Sharing passwords for streaming services like Netflix is illegal in the UK, according to a new ruling from the government. It's common for subscribers to let friends and relatives know their login details. Netflix has never taken legal action over this, despite a slowdown in growth, even though it's against their terms of service.
Elon Musk says he'll step down as chief executive of Twitter as soon as he's found someone foolish enough to take over, in his words, and he would run the software and service teams. This is the first time that he's talked about quitting following a recent Twitter user vote. The majority of the users who voted called for him to resign.
The manufacturing company 3M says it's going to stop producing chemicals known as PFAs by 2025. Substances used to make cleaning products, non-stick pans and cell phones have been linked to a range of health issues. PFAs are slow to break down and have been found in high concentrations in drinking water, soil and foods.
It's Germany's biggest ever accounting fraud, another dramatic week of accusations and recriminations at the Wirecard trial.
A former executive has branded the disgraced payments firm a scam from the start and accused ex-CEO Marcus Braun of being at the heart of the accounting fraud, charges he denies. The company collapsed 2 years ago with around $2 billion missing from its accounts.
Well, our correspondent Natalie Carney is in Munich, where this trial is taking place. This is like something out of a film, isn't it? The trial has the makings of an epic.
Absolutely. I'm certain that Hollywood's already writing the screenplay for this one, no doubt, with one of them on the run and the CEO having been in jail for the last 2.5 years. But this week we have heard a lot from the head of Wirecard's, or former head, I should say, of Wirecard's Dubai branch, Oliver Bellenhaus. Now, he's become quite the star witness for the prosecution in this trial. On Monday, he spoke for about 5 hours, and on Wednesday, Wednesday, as you've mentioned, he told the Munich court that the fraud at the company started well before 2015, which is when the indictment said it was likely to have started. And he also said that Wirecard was a cancer that had gone undetected for a long time. The group's business in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, through which Wirecard essentially booked fictitious proceeds of almost 2 billion euros, was largely invented from the start, said Bellenhaus, saying the data was never authentic, but that there was no indication that the company would have been profitable or successful prior to 2015 unless those businesses had been tampered with, had been engrossed, so to speak. Bellenhaus also accused the former CEO, Marcus Braun, of being the gang leader and being intoxicated by the growth of the company. He also called Wirecard's management criminals and gamblers. Bellenhaus also accused the third defendant that's on trial at the moment, the former accountant of Wirecard, Stefan van Erfa, of being the driver in this fraud. Both Erfa and Braun have denied the accusations against them, have denied what the accusations that the prosecution has made, that they basically invented sales for the company in order to secure billions in loans. Whereas Bellenhaus, right after the business folded back in the summer of 2020, turned himself into police, admitting his part in this fraud and saying he's very regretful for everything that has happened. Now, of course, there's also a fourth man that's involved in this fiasco, in this scandal, Jan Meselik. But as soon as the company went bust and there were arrest warrants put out for these men, he took off, and he's basically been on the run ever since in a very sort of James Bond style escape from a small regional airport in Austria. Last he was reported in the beginning of this year to be somewhere in Russia, so very much out of the hands under the current political situations from European police, of course.
Natalie, obviously a huge scandal for the corporate world, but there have been political ramifications over this too.
Yes, absolutely. When this all went down back in 2020, at the time, the current Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, he was the finance minister of Germany, and he was brought in front of a parliamentary committee to basically answer questions about when he knew of the problems that were happening in Wirecard, because there was some data that was discovered that showed that Scholz did know that there were some malpractices going on in the company well before 2019, as well as the former economics minister of Germany, Peter Altmaier. He too was grilled by this parliamentary committee on the same basis. And even the chancellor at the time, Germany's mama, as she was called, Mutter of Germany, Angela Merkel, was brought in front of this committee because she had gone to China on a diplomatic trip back in 2019 and had bigged up Wirecard, had mentioned that Wirecard was a fabulous company to get behind. And this was at a time when journalists were already questioning, quite rightly, the business happenings behind the scenes at Wirecard. Nothing ever came of those, but the organization that watches over the financial affairs of Germany, BaFin, they have come under sharp criticism, and a lot of changes have happened there to ensure that this does not happen again.
Natalie, thank you for that. Our correspondent, Natalie Carney in Munich.
You're watching CGTN. Still to come, meet the bridge builders, how one British businessman became to be known as Mr. China.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore,
We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference? The difference is in the detail, the background,
defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Andrew Wilson. Our top stories: Ukraine's President Zelensky on his way to Washington to meet President Biden as the United States looks to supply Kyiv with the Patriot missile system to boost air defenses.
President Putin tells his generals Russia isn't to blame for his invasion of Ukraine, saying that the two countries share a tragedy.
Let's just stay with that story because President Putin has announced plans to increase Russia's military effort in Ukraine.
He said a new generation of Russian ballistic missiles would be deployed to boost efforts on the front line, which he said would have no equivalent in the world. Well, our correspondent Dasha Chermasheva is in Moscow for us. Dasha, what more has Putin been saying?
Yes, indeed, we've heard the address of the Russian president to the military chiefs. So the Russian president outlined the priorities for the country, which is the defense of Russia's sovereignty and Russia's security. For that, Russia will be modernizing its military as well as the weapons supplies. Having said that, he stressed that there will be no financial limit on what the government could spend when it comes to the hardware and other modernizational efforts for the Russian military. At the same time, he stressed Russian economy will not be militarized. So all that will be the smooth process that will not be taking place at the expense of the taxpayers. So what he also said was that NATO was something that Russia was fearing and that Russia had to respond to because of NATO's continuous desire, as the Russian president has put it forward, to expand. So now, as there will be new members of Finland and Sweden, Russia says it will have to beef up its presence on the northwestern flanks of the country. There will be, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, also two new military districts created in the country, the one for Moscow and Leningrad. So all in all, we've heard Russia once again blaming the Western countries of starting this whole special military operation, or forcing Russia to start its special military operation, rather. And also we've heard the Russian president saying that some of the most sophisticated weapons that have no analogs worldwide will be coming on combat duty. Those are the Sarmas, the Avangard, for instance. Avangard is the one of the most sophisticated weapons that has been announced by the Russian president in 2018. This is something that is the weapon that is capable of flying at 27 times the speed of the sound and is impossible to be intercepted. So all in all, we've heard a very powerful message sent by the Russian president to the world, stressing that Russia will stick to the course that it has chosen.
And Dasha, what about troop numbers? Are there any plans for more conscription efforts in Russia?
Well, as we have heard from the Russian president, there have been 300,000 people who have been mobilized in the partial mobilization. Of them, 150 have been deployed to the area of the special military operation, as Moscow describes it, and another 150 are now on the training ground. So this, according to Vladimir Putin, is sufficient, so there is no need for additional conscription. At the same time, we've heard from the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu that the Russian army in general needs an increase, and the number will have to increase by 30%, coming up to 1.5 million servicemen in the army. At the same time, what Russia is saying that all of the tasks that have been set by the Russian authorities, including with regards to the special military operation, as Russia describes it, and in general for Russia's security, will be achieved no matter what.
Dasha, thanks very much indeed. Dasha Chernyshova there in Moscow for us.
Germany has sent its first batch of BioNTech vaccines to China, the first time a foreign coronavirus vaccine has been delivered there. They're to be administered initially to the 20,000 German nationals living in the country. At the same time, Chinese citizens in Europe will start being vaccinated with China's Sinovac jab. Let's talk to our correspondent Peter Oliver in Berlin. Peter, what's the significance of this vaccine delivery?
Well, the significance is that it shows that those links between Berlin and Beijing are strong and continuing to be strong. We saw that Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, was the first European leader to go to Beijing since COVID started. That was back at the beginning of November. And this particular delivery that we've seen take place on Wednesday came after a phone call on Tuesday evening between President Xi in Beijing and President Steinmeier here in Berlin. What we have seen is China increasingly looking to try and improve that relationship with Berlin, Berlin looking to reciprocate that, as well as China sees Germany as that way into improving relations and continuing already in good relations between itself and the European Union, looking at Berlin as the way into doing that.
And in terms of the hard agreements, what actually has been agreed between the Chinese and German governments?
Right, well, what we know is the first load is in the air already. It's already heading towards China. The German government spokesperson who is confirming this on Wednesday wasn't giving away an awful lot extra about exactly what was going to be on board that plane, when it would arrive, and all of those details. But what he did say is that this shipment of the BioNTech vaccine was going to be for German nationals living in China. There's currently around 20,000 or so of those. However, Berlin was looking to try and expand that deal to allow this vaccine to be given to expatriates, foreigners from all over the world in China as well. What we do know is, in reciprocation to this, that the Sinovac vaccine has been given the green light by the health ministry here in Berlin to be both imported and given out to people across Germany from China here in Europe. So basically it's a reciprocation of those two vaccines, the BioNTech vaccine going towards China, the Sinovac vaccine coming here to Europe.
Peter, thank you for that. Our correspondent Peter Oliver in Berlin.
China is battling a wave of COVID infections as the country eases lockdown policies.
Beijing has transformed some stadiums, exhibition halls and other public venues into temporary clinics to try to help further relieve the pressure on the hospitals. Our correspondent Huang Yue reports.
This makeshift fever clinic has been set up at a stadium in downtown Beijing. Since starting operation on December the 14th, it provides medical services every day from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. Most of the medical workers here are from local public hospitals. Some are from Shandong province, who came to support Beijing amid this wave of COVID-19 resurgence.
We mainly receive patients aged from 16 to 65 who suffer from respiratory tract infections. Those who have severe underlying diseases or need emergency treatment are suggested to go to hospitals if it's necessary, rather than coming to this simply equipped fever clinic.
As you can see, several tents have been put up at the stadium, and they are used as a temporary registration office, consulting rooms, and a pharmacy. It's freezing cold these days in Beijing, so setting up such a fever clinic at the stadium can shelter patients from waiting in long lines in wind.
It takes me only about 5 minutes to wait in line. I got fever several days ago. Now with the medication, I won't be worried.
My wife, my mother, and I all tested positive. We had fever. I think it might be easier to get cross-infection if I go to the hospital, because there could be more people there. So I came here to be prescribed fever and coughing drugs.
Doctors say a week ago, when they started work here, they treated patients until midnight. But now they're seeing fewer people.
When we first started operation, there were about 800 to 850 patients coming here every day. But in recent days, the number of people continues to decline. Yesterday, we received about 400 patients. I think this is a positive signal.
Local government says the supply and demand for medical care and drugs is still in a tight balance in Beijing amid the current seasonal influenza and COVID-19 infections. But the capital city is taking measures to increase its capacity to respond.
Latest data shows Beijing now has over 1,200 fever clinics, including those in hospitals and communities. So far, 8 districts in Beijing have transformed public facilities such as theaters and stadiums into makeshift fever clinics to help relieve the burden at hospitals. And all the community health service centers have also set up diagnosis areas for residents who show symptoms such as fever and coughing to seek medical help near their home. Huang Yue, CGTN, Beijing.
The Taliban has banned women from attending university in Afghanistan, drawing condemnation from the United Nations and foreign governments. Female students were turned away from campuses on Wednesday as some were expecting to sit their end-of-term exams. Girls have already been excluded from secondary school since the Taliban returned to power last year.
The UK Interior Minister says disused cruise ships could be used to house asylum seekers while their claims are being processed. Suella Braverman has criticised the exorbitant cost of putting migrants up in hotels, saying it costs the taxpayer more than $5 million a day. The government's looking into alternative accommodation, with disused holiday parks and former student halls being considered.
Scotland is about to pass a controversial law giving new rights to teenagers who want to change gender. The bill in the Scottish Parliament will remove the need for a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria to be made before a person undergoes surgery. Changes to the minimum age for gender reassignment and the required period spent living as a member of the opposite sex will be cut from 2 years to 3 months.
The endangered pink iguana appears to be making a comeback from the brink of extinction. Scientists have discovered hatchling and juvenile populations of the reptile, which is actually born green. Its only native habitat is a single Galapagos island, and the species was only discovered in 1986, with just a few hundred thought to be still in existence. Adult pink iguanas can grow to up to half a metre long.
Thousands of Christmas holidaymakers could face long waits at the UK's airports as Border Force officials go on strike.
Employees at Heathrow, Gatwick, Manchester, Birmingham and Glasgow airports are due to walk out for 8 days over the holiday. Paul Charles is a travel industry commentator. Paul, thanks for joining us. It sounds like a lot of disruption. What do we know about the days involved and what sort of impact we're going to experience?
Sadly, there will be disruption. There are 8 days of strikes by some Border Force officials at the key airports across the UK, including Heathrow, Gatwick and Manchester, as well as the port of Newhaven. So it's also affecting ferry passengers. But the bulk of passengers who will be affected will be those arriving into those key airports between this Friday, the 23rd of December, and New Year's Eve on the 31st of December. And it's a pretty tough 8-day strike. Obviously, workers are asking for more money in the face of high inflation. But for many travellers, of course, who will be arriving at those airports, they are likely to face long delays. And that could mean queues of passengers coming out of the airports, but also being left on planes as well after they've landed.
Any sort of mitigating activities taking place to make the experience easier for passengers? Will some of the staff be working, or are the airports bringing in other staff?
That's a really good question. What we're seeing is a hardened UK government refusing to negotiate on higher pay. So they're bringing in military backup. They're bringing in army workers who will do the job of those border officials. But there's no way they're going to be able to do the job completely. So there will be disruption. And what's been going on behind the scenes is that Heathrow, in particular, have asked British Airways and Virgin Atlantic to stop selling tickets over that period for those arriving in the UK. Also, airlines have been asked to come up with contingency plans for what they will do with passengers who have to stay on planes because the terminals will be too busy. And that means that airlines are having to look at how they will feed and give water and other drinks to passengers in case they're stuck on planes for upwards of 2 or 3 hours waiting to get into the terminals. And that is a possibility.
I mean, Paul, this is turning into a season of industrial action for the UK in general. Do you think border force operators have seen this as an opportunity? Do you think there's a connection?
Well, there's enormous frustration among many key workers, not just in border force, as you say, but also on British Railways, in our hospitals, among Royal Mail workers. There's this deepening frustration that their pay rates are not going up as high as inflation. And the government's refusing to budge on increasing rates. Border force officials themselves have been uptight and angry for some time about deteriorating conditions in our airports. So they feel now is the time to protest. And this is one of the peak periods of the year. So they're determined to make sure the public are aware just how angry they are about these conditions.
I mean, Paul, stepping back a bit, looking at the general wider industry, what kind of a year has it had post-pandemic 2022?
It's actually been a more encouraging year in the main since COVID. Obviously, what you've seen is border restrictions being removed as countries recover. That means airlines have been able to get flying again, get their schedules nearly back to normal. Most airlines are flying around 15 to 20% fewer planes than they were before the pandemic, but they're becoming more profitable. So airlines themselves and airports have become much more profitable during 2022. They had a very, very good summer in the main and a very good third and fourth quarter, albeit for us as passengers, we faced a lot of issues, of course, at airports around the world, namely Schiphol in Amsterdam and Heathrow in London, where bags were going missing and huge delays built up due to a shortage of airport workers being able to deal with us as passengers. So the good news is the industry is back, but it's not quite as profitable as it was pre-pandemic. It will be next year. And the challenges remain, of course, around cost of living crisis and high inflation feeding through to higher ticket prices. So we'll see what impact that has in 2023.
Indeed, Paul, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Paul Charles there.
You're watching CGTN, still ahead, welcoming the solstice sun. Revellers gather at ancient sites for the Northern Hemisphere's shortest day.
I fell in love with Chinese culture the second I started to experience it.
70 years ago, a small group of British businessmen travelled to China to unlock opportunities between the two countries. They became known as the icebreakers.
Building bridges is a natural thing. There's no age and gender difference in our spirit, no race difference in our soul.
I think food is an incredible way of bringing different cultures together. I am enjoying learning every aspect about it.
Chinese literature stretches back for millennia, but it's still really relevant for today.
I hope that Chinese and British fashion community could be more frequently communicating with each other.
An incredible mix of people, cultures, food, and there is so much to see and so much to do.
I have a great desire to make the Chinese civilization more accessible.
It's about our future generation's future.
The craftsmanship, the technique, the material uses, the color uses.
You can kind of take things on board and continue to develop and grow.
Meet the bridge builders, the individuals who dare to think beyond the horizon and open up our world.
Everything seems to have a story. I just think that's absolutely beautiful. A huge tick.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. They are the men and women who have spent their lives building relationships between Britain and China. Tim Clissold is a British businessman who is now known as Mr. China.
That's after he lost $400 million in investment, earned it back, and forged a decades-long career in China.
70 years ago, a small group of British businessmen travelled to China to unlock opportunities between the two countries. They became known as the icebreakers. Meet the bridge builders, the individuals who dare to think beyond the horizon and open up our world.
My name's Tim Clissold, and I was born and grew up in North Yorkshire. And in my mid-20s, I had an opportunity to go to Hong Kong. And I spent a great deal of time in my life in China. And I was originally involved in private equity investment there. And I gradually became more and more interested in sorting out problems there, with quite complex problems. The first time I went to China, I immediately found the geographical setting of Hong Kong to be tremendously dramatic, because it's a very sharp mountain that overlooks a harbour. On the other side, there are 9 hills. And I just had this feeling it was something very big and mysterious, the other side of these 9 hills. So for some reason, I was kind of drawn to China. And I went up on a ferry from Hong Kong to Guangzhou, about 70 miles. This is in 1987. And it felt as though I'd gone back in time at least 70 years, because China wasn't really very developed at that stage. No internal combustion engines, almost no street lighting, almost no kind of automation. And I travelled right the way through to central China and then down to Chengdu, along the Yangtze, up to Beijing, Datong. And the basic impression that I had in China was that people would get up early in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, there'd be people taking vegetables to a market. Very, very active and striving. So that's why I decided that I would focus in on China and learn the language and try and do business in China. Around the late 80s and the early 90s, there was a sea change. The senior analyst, who's a very famous man called Barton Biggs from Morgan Stanley, came out to Hong Kong and he spent 4 or 5 days on the mainland. And when he came back, there was a press conference where he said, I'm tuned in, overfed and maximum bullish. And huge amounts of capital moved very quickly because they were basically reallocating funds towards stocks in the region. So that then stimulated private investors, and they had money and they wanted to put it to work in businesses in China, but they had no capacity to find businesses in China or analyse them. So that's where I got involved. Basically raising a lot of money from US investors, about $480 million US dollars, investing that in factories all over China, and then realising that the contracts that underpinned the investment really weren't, you couldn't implement them. And we eventually sorted out and reached an accommodation with the Chinese partners, which I'm very pleased about and proud of, actually. And I just thought that is worth writing this experience down for first of all, for me to be able to make sense of it, because the act of writing something down forces you to rationalise it all. But I also thought that it would be, useful for other people who wanted to come and invest in China.
I spent a tremendous amount of time in China and lived there for a very long time, and in fact I brought up a family of 4 children there. And that experience has obviously deeply affected me, and I just think there's a lot of things that I learned there that are tremendously useful as reference points for Western society. So I have a great kind of desire to make the Chinese civilization more accessible to foreign people. And the way that I've done that is actually through translating some of China's most famous poets.
安得万里求，盖国周思淫。
And the reason why I chose that is because they really speak to issues that are tremendously important now, and they use a language which we can really bind with on an emotional basis.
In terms of the Chinese attitude towards the UK, the things that ordinary Chinese people know about the UK are quite enduring. So, literature. Basically, every Chinese child knows about Shakespeare. Shakespeare is actually compulsory in Chinese education system. But there's absolutely no corresponding level of knowledge in Western society about China. And I think that's a big problem. When I came back, when my children came back from China, they'd been in Chinese schools and they wanted to continue their Chinese education in the UK, and it basically isn't possible. Over the past few years, I've coordinated the creation of a new A-level syllabus in Chinese civilization, and that was written by 12 of the leading China scholars in the UK, based at a variety of universities. And it needs to be approved by Ofqual, which is the regulator, the educational regulator, and that needs sign-off by the UK government. And that has proved to be very, very difficult. And I just find that tremendously disappointing. But, you know, I'm not going to give up, so I'll just continue to try to push it forward. In terms of the future of the relationship between China and the UK, China is a reality. We don't need to talk about the peaceful rise of China. It's already happened, and it was peaceful. I mean, I would hope that we can get some wisdom from Confucius, which is like 求同存异, which is look for the commonalities and just park the differences, talk about those differences and try and bridge those differences, but just don't make those the most important part of the relationship. Because there are other things where it's so important we cooperate and understand each other.
Finally, if it's still Wednesday where you are, then it is the shortest day of the year, or the longest night, if you prefer. As the sun came up on the winter solstice, people gathered to watch at ancient sites across the northern hemisphere, including Luxor in Egypt.
Every year, the sun lines up with the axis of an ancient temple in the city, which is home to some of the country's most famous historic sites. Things were just a little colder around 5,000 kilometres further north at Stonehenge in the UK.
The headlines again. Ukraine's President Zelensky is on his way to Washington to meet President Biden as the US looks to supply Kyiv with the Patriot missile system to boost air defense.
Our other headlines: President Vladimir Putin announces plans to send a new generation of ballistic missiles to Ukraine to boost Russia's military efforts.
Don't get ill. The warning as UK ambulance crews go on strike in a dispute over pay and conditions.
And that's just about it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
More on all our stories at neweurope.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team in London, goodbye. Goodbye.